On September 19, 1796, a newspaper named the American Daily Advertiser published a document addressed to the people of the United States. It was written by President George Washington and announced that he would retire from the nation's highest office after almost half a century of public service. But the vast majority of the text was dedicated to advice Washington was giving to his fellow citizens. They were, in his words, quote, sentiments which are the result of much reflection and all important to the permanency of your felicity as a people. This document, now known as Washington's Farewell Address, talks a lot about political parties and the Constitution, but one of the most famous sections deals with foreign policy. Here, Washington warned his countrymen to, quote, observe good faith and justice toward all nations, and cultivate peace and harmony with all. Washington believed that, as a republic, that America should act differently than the other nations of the world. He wrote, quote, it will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period a great nation to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. But this advice was not just a matter of the country's morality and honor. It was also one of strategic necessity. Washington feared that to do otherwise would mean getting involved in foreign wars. That, he felt, would threaten the well-being, maybe even the existence of the young United States. He writes that, quote, the nation prompted by ill will and resentment sometimes impels to war the government, contrary to the best calculations of policy. The government sometimes participates in the national propensity and adopts through passion what reason would reject. To avoid the temptations to war, Washington famously advised, quote, to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. To Washington, the reasons were obvious. He asked, quote, why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? In essence, Washington was asking the American people to remain as independent as possible. He was calling for the United States to avoid being dragged into the intrigue and the conflicts that characterized European empires for both moral and strategic reasons. And in doing so, Washington was putting the full weight of his prestige behind those sentiments. Indeed, throughout American history, as the nation faced new foreign policy challenges, citizens, scholars, and statesmen would recall Washington's advice to steer clear of foreign entanglements and avoid wars whenever possible. As the United States grew to become the most powerful nation in the world, many credited Washington's advice for guiding the nation towards peace and giving it the space it needed to prosper. Even until the middle of the 20th century, when President Harry S. Truman committed America into NATO, critics still warned that we were departing from our most fundamental principles, principles that made us a world power, principles that distinguished ourselves as Americans. Today, the United States has about 60 collective defense treaties with other nations, and almost 300,000 active-duty military personnel deployed in over 150 countries. We've gotten involved in numerous foreign interventions, both small and large. Critics, who are often referred to as either non-interventionist or isolationist, say that we've betrayed Washington's advice, and that now the United States is no different from the European empires we tried to distinguish ourselves from. But those critics have critics themselves. These are often referred to as internationalists. Some today use the term globalist. They argue that Washington didn't mean for America to avoid entanglements or war at all times. They argue that the situation has changed, that Washington's principles were good for a time, when America was young and weak. But now that we are a world power, we have certain responsibilities, and that we must entangle ourselves with the world. They point out that in his farewell address, Washington himself said, quote, if we remain one people under an efficient government, the period is not far off when we may choose peace or war as our interest, guided by our justice, shall counsel. While he hoped to avoid war, Washington envisioned a day not far off when the country would have greater freedom to choose peace or war according to its interest and its principles. Internationalists argue that he would have recognized that the country had to involve itself in the world as it attained greater power and greater responsibilities in the international arena, that we had to avoid entanglements and wars for a time, but one day we, as a world power, would have to engage in them out of necessity. Both the internationalists and the non-interventionists or isolationists claim Washington on their side, but the debate continues to this day. To what degree should the United States entangle itself in the world? When should it go to war? To what degree should America act the way other countries do? Should America acquire territory abroad? Should it build an empire? Do republics build empires? At the end of the 19th century, as the United States was adjusting to its role as a world power, this debate rose to a greater level of importance than ever before. And both sides claimed to be the true heirs of the founding, the true followers of Washington, and believed that the other side betrayed his legacy. It was a struggle for the very identity of the United States. That story and the two men who led our country during that time are the subjects of this episode of This American President. The mid to late 19th century was an exciting time to be alive. The people at the time saw a dizzying number of changes, especially in science and technology, that revolutionized their lives. This was the era when Morse, Bell, and Marconi made it possible to communicate to people thousands of miles away, when Pasteur made it possible to store food for longer, when Benz built the world's first car, and when Roentgen discovered X-rays. And don't forget the most prolific inventor of the time, Thomas Edison, with his phonograph, his motion picture camera, and light bulb. And we haven't even talked about Henry Ford, Albert Einstein, and the Wright brothers, whose greatest achievements were ahead of them. In the space of one lifetime, people were being introduced to cars, planes, radios, phones, light bulbs, and medical technology that prolonged their lives. If there was ever a time that mankind was making great strides, it was the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries. And if there was a country that stood at the forefront of the new age, it was the United States. By the 1890s, more than 100 years had passed since the United States won independence. It was still one of the youngest countries in the world. But the same country that Washington feared would be the pawn of European empires was already a giant. What had started out as 13 colonies on the east coast of North America was now a continental-sized world power that reached all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Its population had grown exponentially from about 4 million in 1790 to over 60 million in 1890, and it was well on its way to becoming the world leader in manufacturing and industrialization. In fact, by 1900, the United States already accounted for half the entire world's manufacturing capacity and had overtaken Britain in iron, steel, and coal production. Think about that. Other nations, including the most advanced nations in the world, had been around for centuries, if not several millennia. And here was one of the youngest countries dominating, in economic terms, the rest of the world put together. A lot of this came from the building of railroads. From the end of the 1870s to the 1890s, railroads were being built at breakneck pace. By 1900, the United States had 40% of the world's total miles of railroad. The rising economy and the new immigrant population also meant the rise of cities. From 1790 to 1890, the percentage of Americans living in urban regions increased sevenfold. There are many ways to measure this, but the bottom line is that America was growing at an astonishing and unprecedented rate. These changes unsettled the social fabric of the country and led to a great deal of change. As with any economic change, there were winners and losers. Robber barons were building unprecedented amounts of wealth, and companies were being combined into massive monopolies. But the average American lived far better and earned more money than the vast majority of the rest of the world. Still, many others, like farmers or industrial workers, felt they were being left behind. Workers formed unions, and strikes broke out across the country. And racial divisions, whether between blacks and whites or between native-born citizens and immigrants, continued to simmer in the wake of the Civil War. Reform was in the air. In the 1860s, slavery had been abolished, but a new generation of Americans crusaded against what they perceived to be the problems of the age. They fought against Jim Crow, against child labor, against monopolies, and for women's suffrage. It was also an era when Americans and the people around the world were intrigued and infatuated with new ideas they hoped could solve these problems. It was the era of isms, anarchism, Darwinism, nationalism, and communism. It was during this exciting, daring, and unsettling time that the United States emerged as a world power. All of this came under the backdrop of European imperialism. Now, this is one of those topics that you could spend your entire life studying, and that's outside the scope of this episode. So for our purposes, I've consulted Webster's dictionary for the quick definition of the word imperialism, which states that imperialism is, quote, the policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion of a nation, especially by direct territorial acquisitions or by gaining indirect control over the political or the economic life of other areas. If you go by this definition, you could argue that imperialism has been with humanity as long as humans have organized into societies, since societies have sought to directly or indirectly influence or dominate others since the dawn of time. In this episode, our definition of imperialism refers to what was happening in the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, basically when European empires were competing to grab massive amounts of territory and whole nations around the world. It was known as the era of New Imperialism, and it was a golden age for European expansionism. In a relatively short period of time, Europe was swallowing up almost all of Africa and large parts of China and Central and Southern Asia. 90% of the entire African continent fell under foreign control. Great Britain had been in the massive nation of India for some time, but now it was tightening its rule. By 1876, Queen Victoria had added Empress of India to her titles. Before long, the British were in Burma, Malaya, Singapore, and Borneo. The Dutch had taken Indonesia, and the French had taken Indochina. And multiple European powers, plus Japan, had established spheres of influence in the once proud Chinese Empire. Although imperialism had existed since the beginning of time, no other continent had ever come as close to dominating the rest of the world as Europe did in the 19th century. For many, national greatness was measured by the number of colonial possessions. If that was the case, then America was far behind the curve. But that was fine with many Americans. After all, America's economy was already dominating, and we didn't have to take over any colonies to do it. And there was always the belief that America was unique. It was conceived with the principle that all men are created equal, and that governments were instituted with the consent of the governed. Many of its citizens felt that these principles were incompatible with ruling foreign peoples, especially if it was against their will. But America also had a history of expansion. In our previous 2 episodes, we covered the Mexican-American War under President James K. Polk. Feel free to listen to them if you haven't already for background information. During that time, the United States fought a war that many Americans questioned and where it acquired large quantities of territory formerly held by Mexico. To many, this was pretty close to European conquest and imperialism. But as you will learn in those episodes, Mexico didn't help her cause, considering how incompetent, dictatorial, and corrupt their government was. And it's no wonder people wanted to leave Mexico, especially considering that it was a stagnating country, while the United States was a rising giant. To this day, debate rages about the United States' conduct in the Mexican-American War. But by the 1890s, that war happened about half a century ago and was a distant memory. And it was one thing to get into a war with your neighbor for territory that your own citizens are populating. It's another thing to go out into the world and grab lands filled with people you barely know. By the 1890s, the United States had never acquired an overseas territory. But as it became a bigger player in the world, it couldn't help but notice that all its competitors were taking over a lot of land. And I don't think it's a surprise that Americans began wondering, should we join in? I mean, isn't that what great nations do? And aren't we becoming a great nation? It's the classic temptation to keep up with the Joneses. It's the fear that if we don't jump in and grab a few colonies, we might be left behind. But wait, aren't we different? We're a republic. Republics don't conquer other countries and rule them without their consent. Didn't we declare ourselves a nation specifically because we were ruled by an imperial power without our consent? And besides, do we really need to do it? We seem to be doing well, really well, without any overseas colonies, without an empire. These were the great questions that the country faced in the 1890s. They were questions that struck at the core of what it meant to be American, and the path America chose would define its policies throughout the rest of its history. America got its first taste of imperialism in the Hawaiian Islands. Back in 1846, the United States formally recognized the Kingdom of Hawaii. But afterwards, America took a greater interest in the islands for three reasons. First, Hawaii was part of the lucrative sugar trade, and U.S. citizens were going there to buy sugar plantations. Second, Christian missionaries wanted to spread the gospel to Hawaiian natives. And third, Hawaii, especially Pearl Harbor, might be a valuable naval port to guard the American West Coast. By the 1880s, David Kalikoa was the reigning king of Hawaii. When it comes to Kalikoa, the historical accounts differ. His critics claimed he was an incompetent and corrupt ruler who ran up Hawaii's debt. Many of those critics came from what has been described as a group of whites who either immigrated or were born in Hawaii. Other accounts, mostly from native Hawaiians, claimed that those critics were just a small self-interested minority and that Kalikoa was actually a great leader whose reign was a golden age for Hawaii. But for those who believe the former, they started thinking that it wouldn't be a bad thing if America came in to clean things up. So the United States began pressuring him to hand over control of Pearl Harbor. Kalikoa and many native Hawaiians were afraid that this would be the first step in a full American takeover of the islands, so he resisted. But by 1887, the king caved and allowed the United States to lease the harbor. One of Kalikoa's opponents was a man named Loren Thurston. He was a white man who was born in Hawaii and was the grandson of the first Christian missionaries to the islands. Thurston had risen to become a member of the Hawaiian legislature and the island's Minister of Interior. And when you read about him, it becomes clear that he was more loyal to the foreign whites than to the native Hawaiians. Eventually, Thurston and other critics of Kalikoa's government banded together and became more aggressive. They drafted a new constitution in 1887 and forced the king to sign it. This document was known as the Bayonet Constitution and took away most of the powers of the monarchy and reduced the voting power of native Hawaiians. As a result, the white minority became the dominant voting bloc on the islands. Kalikoa died in 1890, and his sister, Liliuokalani, took over the throne. She tried to undo Thurston's work and restore power to the monarchy by drafting a new constitution in 1893. This constitution basically would have reversed the Bayonet Constitution, empowering the Queen and native Hawaiians and reducing the power of the white and business class. The Queen claimed that she did this because of a wave of support from the people. But Thurston and his supporters cried foul and decided to take the momentous step of overthrowing Liliuokalani. Thurston and his men formed a group called the Committee of Safety on January 14, 1893. And for anyone who's studied history, it's never a good thing when that happens. The committee included officials in the Hawaiian government who were also American and European citizens. At the same time, the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, John Stevens, decided that a nice little show of force would do the trick. So he summoned a company of U.S. Marines and 2 companies of U.S. sailors to Hawaii to, quote, protect American lives and property. The company arrived on January 16th. Threatened by the U.S. military, Liliuokalani abdicated her throne the following day. Thurston and his men were now in charge of Hawaii. They then demanded that the United States annex the Hawaiian Islands. Back in Washington, America had just inaugurated a new president. He was Grover Cleveland, Democrat from New York, and took office on March 4, 1893, as the 24th President of the United States. In response to the request for annexation, Cleveland ordered an investigation into what had happened in Hawaii. The investigation was led by former U.S. Congressman James H. Blunt. By July 17, 1893, the Blunt Report came out and declared that, quote, the United States diplomatic and military representatives had abused their authority and were responsible for the change in government, and that, quote, substantial wrong has thus been done with a due regard for our national character, as well as the rights of the injured people, requires we should endeavor to repair the monarchy. In essence, it said that the overthrow of Hawaii's queen was illegitimate. That December, in his State of the Union address, President Cleveland said that, quote, the questions arising from our relations with Hawaii have caused serious embarrassment. He accepted the results of the Blunt Report, saying, quote, that it was beyond all question that the constitutional government of Hawaii had been subverted with the active aid of our representative to that government, and through the intimidation caused by the presence of an armed naval force of the United States. Upon the facts developed, it seemed to me the only honorable course for a government to pursue was to undo the wrong that had been done by those representing us, and to restore as far as practicable the status existing at the time of our forcible intervention. Cleveland was taking a stand. America would not annex Hawaii under his watch. But some in Congress supported annexation, and they fought back. They published a separate report rejecting Blunt's findings and exonerating the United States for blame in the overthrow. A stalemate ensued. As a result, the Queen was never reinstated, and the U.S. government did recognize the new Republic of Hawaii. But the annexationists failed to get Hawaii annexed because the President of the United States wasn't one of them. Overthrowing the government is one thing, controversial as it was, but annexation was another. President Cleveland was a conservative and non-interventionist. America, getting its first taste of imperialism, had a president who would not be tempted by what many considered the forbidden fruit of imperialism. But it was a temptation that would outlast Cleveland's term. And two men would soon rise to the highest level of American political power and change their country's foreign policy forever. Although the Democrats had the White House, a major depression began in 1893, ruining President Cleveland's popularity. As the 1896 presidential election neared, the Republicans were optimistic about their prospects for winning the White House. The high unemployment of the Depression led many to favor increased protectionism, and one man was known to be the nation's foremost advocate for protectionism, the governor of Ohio, 53-year-old William McKinley. McKinley was born in 1843 and was the seventh of 8 children. He came from a devout Methodist family, and his father was involved in the iron manufacturing industry. The Civil War broke out when McKinley was 18, and he joined the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. He participated in the Battle of Antietam, one of the bloodiest battles in American history, and was cited for heroism. McKinley eventually rose to the rank of brevet major, and he served on the staff of Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, a fellow Ohioan who had become his mentor. Hayes eventually became the 19th President of the United States. You can learn more about him in our 3rd episode of This American President, titled Fake News and Nasty Men. After the war, McKinley became a lawyer and married a woman named Ida Saxton in 1871. The two were happily married and had 2 daughters, but tragically both died before reaching the age of 4. The McKinleys had no more children, and Ida suffered from severe depression. Even worse, she developed epilepsy that left her an invalid. For the rest of his life, McKinley remained a devoted husband to Ida and remained by her side as much as possible. As his mentor, Rutherford Hayes, rose in American politics, McKinley himself cultivated a political career of his own, winning the office of county prosecutor in 1869 at the age of 26. In 1876, Hayes won the presidency. That same year, 33-year-old William McKinley was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he would serve until 1891. During that time, McKinley became the chair of the powerful Ways and Means Committee. This allowed McKinley to push for his protectionist agenda and get a major tariff bill, the McKinley Tariff, passed in 1890. This made McKinley a nationally known figure. In 1891, he ran for governor of Ohio and narrowly won. As governor, McKinley honed his political skills. His popularity carried him to an easy re-election win in 1893. His success as governor, along with the importance of Ohio in national elections, made him the frontrunner for the 1896 presidential election. McKinley had a major asset in a man named Mark Hanna. Hanna was also from Ohio and had made a fortune in the railroad and coal industries. He parlayed his wealth into political power, and at some point became acquainted with McKinley, and the two began a political partnership that would reach the pinnacle of American power. Thanks to Hanna's work behind the scenes, McKinley won the Republican nomination for the presidency on the first ballot. That year, the Democrats rejected the conservatism of Grover Cleveland and turned to a 36-year-old populist, former Congressman William Jennings Bryan of Nebraska. Bryan was a staunch supporter of leaving the gold standard for the unlimited coinage of silver. This would increase inflation and would help suffering farmers in the South and the Midwest and miners in the West. In a time of depression, the message resonated with many Americans, but to most Americans, this was a radical plan that would destabilize the money supply. Hanna channeled the fears of big business into a war chest that raised an unprecedented amount of money for McKinley's campaign. Estimates indicate that McKinley's campaign had 7 times the amount of money Bryan's had. To most Americans, the choice appeared to be McKinley, who stood for sound money, and the populist Bryan, who supported inflation. On Election Day, November 3rd, the American people decided they weren't ready to side with the populists. They elected McKinley 51% to 46.7%. The result in the Electoral College was 271 for McKinley and 176 for Bryan. Despite McKinley's victory, many doubted that the new chief executive was his own man. His massive war chest convinced many that he would be nothing more than a puppet for big business. And many believed that Hanna, himself a wealthy businessman, was the true power behind the throne. And that belief, the notion that McKinley was really just an empty vessel, is one that has persisted and clouded McKinley's historical legacy. There's some fairness to this charge. McKinley's policies were largely friendly to the wealthy. Whether or not that is justified depends on your view on the role of government in the economy. But it's important to remember, at least when it came to Hanna, McKinley was not a mere puppet. There were numerous instances when McKinley overruled Hanna's recommendations. Prior to the Republican Convention in 1876, Hanna had sought out the political bosses in the Republican Party to support McKinley with the promise to give the bosses a say in presidential appointments. McKinley rejected Hanna's efforts and refused to make a deal to get the nomination. Hanna also urged McKinley to campaign on the road like Bryan was doing and deliver speeches on the stump. McKinley rejected this advice and decided to conduct a campaign from his front porch in Ohio. In the words of historian Stanley Jones, quote, "The popularly accepted picture of Hanna's domination was not true. Though McKinley did leave to Hanna the immensely complicated and exceedingly arduous task of organizing the campaign, he himself retained control of the general structure and program. Nothing of significance was done without his approval." Other contemporaries would vouch for McKinley's sharp political skills. His future Secretary of War, Elihu Root, wrote that, quote, "He had a way of handling men so that they thought his ideas were their own. He was a man of great power because he was absolutely indifferent to credit. He cared nothing about the credit, but McKinley always had his way." Congressman Joseph Cannon spoke of McKinley's political ambitions when he quipped that his ear was so close to the ground that it was full of grasshoppers. And Senator Charles Dick said, quote, "I don't think that McKinley ever let anything stand in the way of his own advancement." McKinley assembled his cabinet, naming John Sherman, an elder Republican senator, as Secretary of State, Russell Alger, a former Michigan governor, as Secretary of War, and John D. Long, a former Massachusetts governor and representative, as Secretary of the Navy. Perhaps McKinley's most important appointment was not at the cabinet level, but just below. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who supported McKinley, was pressuring the new president to appoint his friend as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Secretary Long. McKinley was hesitant, saying, quote, "I am told that your friend is always getting into rows with everybody." But McKinley caved and gave Lodge's friend the appointment. One wonders if McKinley knew the significance of that decision. That friend was Theodore Roosevelt, and his rise would soon overshadow McKinley, then and for all of history. By 1897, Theodore Roosevelt was 38 years old, 15 years younger than President McKinley. He was born on October 27, 1858, to a wealthy family in New York City. His father was a prominent businessman, and his mother was a Southerner from Georgia. Roosevelt grew up a sickly child and suffered from asthma. But by his teenage years, Roosevelt demonstrated his willingness to face challenges head-on. He undertook an intense regimen of weightlifting and gymnastics, and overcame his asthma to develop a strong physique. Later in college, he took up rowing, wrestling, and most famously, boxing. For the rest of his life, he was an advocate for what he called the strenuous life. But Roosevelt wasn't just an impressive physical specimen. He was fiercely intellectual and had a remarkable photographic memory. When he was 8 years old, he saw a dead seal at a local market. The sight of the seal fascinated him and sparked a lifelong interest in zoology. He somehow acquired the seal's head, and along with his cousins, formed the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History in his home. He learned the basics of taxidermy and created a makeshift museum with other animals. By the time he enrolled in Harvard University, he was an accomplished naturalist and even published studies on ornithology. In case you didn't know, that's the study of birds. Roosevelt grew up in the lap of luxury. He traveled throughout Europe and the Middle East with his family throughout his upbringing. While at Harvard, Roosevelt was a member of the prestigious Porcelain Club and editor of the Harvard Advocate. Tragedy struck Roosevelt when, at the age of 19, he lost his father. But he inherited a lot of money from his father that left him financially secure for the rest of his life. That same year, he met Alice Hathaway Lee, the daughter of a prominent banker from New England, who he fell in love with and married in 1880 when he was 22 and she was 19. While at Harvard, the precocious young Roosevelt started writing a book on the history of the U.S. Navy during the War of 1812. It was published in 1882 under the title The Naval War of 1812. It was very well researched and to this day is still considered one of the best historical accounts of the war. It also established Roosevelt, already an acknowledged naturalist, as a respected historian by the time he was just 24 years old. By then, he had already won a seat as a Republican in the New York State Assembly, where he won 3 terms and established a reputation as an anti-corruption crusader. You can imagine what Theodore Roosevelt was like at this age. He was already a very accomplished and rising star in New York politics. He was insanely productive. I once read that he was perpetually wired. Apparently, he drank a gallon of coffee every day. So you can imagine he was a man with a huge personality and boundless energy. But something happened that would change his life. On February 12, 1884, Roosevelt's wife Alice gave birth to their first child, a daughter that they named Alice Lee Roosevelt. Upon hearing this news, Roosevelt left the state capital to be with his wife. When he arrived home, his wife was semi-comatose and suffering from kidney failure. As he held her in his arms, she died February 14th, Valentine's Day, at the age of 22. Roosevelt was a widow at the age of 25. In an unspeakable tragic coincidence, his mother had died of typhoid fever in the same house just 11 hours earlier. That day, Roosevelt wrote a giant X in his diary, and the words, quote, "The light has gone out of my life." Roosevelt was so devastated that he moved out to the Dakota Territory and became a rancher. Now, I've always found this to be a fascinating move. I'm not sure how many rich kids that go to Harvard end up moving to the West to be a cowboy, especially ones with promising political careers. But that's what Roosevelt did. After all, he was utterly grief-stricken, and he did love nature. He bought 2 ranches, rode out on the range, hunted grizzly bears, and herded cattle. He became a deputy sheriff, and, in typical Roosevelt fashion, when his boat was stolen, he pursued and captured the thieves. Of course, Roosevelt kept up his academic and civic pursuits, publishing 3 books on life as a rancher and organizing a couple of local community groups. A severe winter in 1886 to 1887 wiped out most of his cattle. With that, Roosevelt returned to life on the East Coast and took care of his daughter Alice. Once again, he found love, this time with a childhood friend named Edith Kermit Carew. He married her in London, England, on December 1886. They would go on to have 5 children together. Roosevelt continued his writing career, publishing several biographies and the highly acclaimed series, The Winning of the West. And he jumped back into politics. He ran for mayor of New York City in 1886, but lost. But in 1889, Republican President Benjamin Harrison appointed him to the Civil Service Commission. While most people considered the appointment a cushy job, Roosevelt made the most of it and took on corruption and patronage. When Democrat Grover Cleveland took office, he reappointed Roosevelt to the commission. In 1895, Roosevelt was appointed as president of the board of the New York City Police Commissioners. The New York City Police Department was known as one of the most corrupt in the country. Roosevelt typically took on the job with a great deal of vigor and gusto. He implemented several reforms, working to implement a strict merit-based system. One of my favorite Roosevelt stories involves his routine walks around New York City at night and early in the morning when he would surprise police officers to make sure they were on duty. Roosevelt was nationally known as an intellectual and a political reformer, but Roosevelt's ambitions went beyond domestic issues. After all, he was an expert on U.S. naval history and had thought deeply about the role of the Navy in America's rise as a world power. He had also read the book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890 by Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. This book was a major influence on Roosevelt and gave him the firm belief that the nation that ruled the seas ruled the world. As a prolific writer, Roosevelt left us with a wealth of information about his beliefs, and they remain both fascinating and challenging. In episodes 4 and 5 of our podcast, we covered his cousin Franklin, the 32nd president, and during that series, I said that FDR poses many challenges to the modern observer, that he had beliefs and characteristics that both liberals and conservatives could either admire or vilify. Well, this is even truer when it comes to Teddy Roosevelt. As you can imagine, Roosevelt never did anything halfway. He went all out. And that's something that thrilled and terrified people. Americans both then and now were uncomfortable with the idea of expansion. Again, it goes back to the question, do republics acquire or conquer territory? To that, Roosevelt bluntly responded with, quote, "Our whole national history has been one of expansion. This expansion is not a matter of regret, but of pride." Americans, going back to the founding, were critics of European imperialism. As Thomas Jefferson said, quote, "If there be one principle more deeply written than any other in the mind of every American, it is that we should have nothing to do with conquest." To that, Roosevelt said, quote, "It is a good thing for Egypt and the Sudan and for the world when England took Egypt and the Sudan. It is a good thing for India that England should control it. I believe in the expansion of great nations." When Washington counseled avoiding war in his farewell address, Roosevelt said during the international incident in the 1880s, quote, "Let the fight come if it must. I don't care whether our seacoast cities are bombarded or not. We should take Canada. And if there is a must, I shall try to have a hand in it myself." Roosevelt also called President Cleveland's rejection of Hawaiian annexation a, quote, "colossal crime," and he favored America taking over the islands. Roosevelt continues to challenge us today. On one hand, he was a Republican who admired Lincoln and always believed slavery to be, quote, "a terrible evil." When it came to racial issues, he has been described as relatively liberal for the time. He said of the contemporary African-American leader, quote, "I do not know a white man of the South who is as good a man as Booker T. Washington today." When it came to African Americans in general, Roosevelt said, quote, "The only wise and honorable and Christian thing to do is to treat each black man and each white man strictly on his merits as a man, giving him no more and no less than he shows himself worthy to have." But Roosevelt had no problem with the idea that certain races were more advanced and civilized than others. He once wrote, quote, "Since I have been a boy and first studied the history of this country, my veins have thrilled and tingled as I read of the conquest of this continent by the white race." Another time he wrote, quote, "I am a believer in the fact that it is for the good of the world that the English-speaking race in all its branches should hold as much of the world's surface as possible. The spread of the little kingdom of Wessex into more than a country, more than an empire, into a race that has conquered half the earth and holds a quarter of it is perhaps the greatest fact in all of history." On another occasion, he wrote, quote, "I believe the great majority of the Negroes in the South are wholly unfit for suffrage, and that if we were able to succeed in giving them an unbought, uncoerced, and undefrauded suffrage, we would reduce parts of the South to the level of Haiti." And another time he wrote, quote, "I do not believe that the average Negro in the United States is yet in any way fit to take care of himself and others as the average white man, for if he were there would be no Negro problem." Roosevelt believed that the more advanced races had both a duty and a right to take over the less advanced races, what many today would call paternalism. Quote, "The path of the race upward will necessarily be painful, and we are not only bound to help the race in every way on the upward path, but work for them. And if helping these races benefited the power of the United States, then all the better." Now, race is obviously a complicated issue. Obviously, many things people said back then about race, going back to our founders, might make us uncomfortable today. And you always have to factor in that people are, to some extent, products of their time. Lots of people felt the way Roosevelt did, and we might too if we lived back then. But these words do help us understand how Roosevelt felt specifically about imperialism, and why he and many others believed it was a good thing. Roosevelt believed in the idea of national greatness, something that would strike modern-day observers as hyper-nationalistic. He believed it much in the same way he believed in individual greatness. Roosevelt believed in the strenuous life, that a life of activity and struggle is what brought out the best in a man. When describing boxing, he said, quote, "Prize fighting is brutal and degrading, but boxing tends to make men manly and courageous." He believed that without the strenuous life, men became weak and flaccid. And he believed the exact same thing for nations and races. That's why you have quotes of him advocating for a war. He believed that war brought out the best in a nation. He once wrote, quote, "One of the prime dangers of civilization has always been its tendency to cause the loss of virile fighting virtues, of the fighting edge. When men get too comfortable and lead too luxurious lives, there is always a danger lest the softness eat like an acid into their manliness of fiber. The barbarian, because of the very conditions of his life, is forced to keep and develop certain hardy qualities which the man of civilization tend to lose. Unless we keep the barbarian virtues, gaining the civilized ones will be of little avail. Over-sentimentality, over-softness, washiness, and mushiness are the great dangers of this age and this people." Roosevelt seemed to have this paradoxical view of civilization. On one hand, civilization was a sign of a particular race's superiority and greatness. This could be seen in the achievement of conquest and the building of empire. But on the other hand, civilization weakened society and weakened the race. In his eyes, it led to laziness and entitlement. Because of that, Roosevelt admired what were considered the less civilized races, the, quote, barbarians who held on to their warlike ways. Perhaps it's why Roosevelt once said, quote, "The most ultimately righteous of all wars is a war with the savages." And I think it's fair to say that Roosevelt saw whites predominantly as the torchbearers of civilization. But from his views on African Americans, it also appears that he believed that non-whites too, though temporarily behind, were capable of achieving civilization as well. Liberals and conservatives have found things to love and hate about him. Many liberals praise his willingness to use government to intervene in the economy and level the playing field, while many conservatives see him as the forefather of big government. On the same note, many conservatives praise Roosevelt for his emphasis on individual liberty, masculinity, and a strong national defense, while some liberals view him as a warmongering imperialist. All of this unabashed embrace of American nationalism, this aggressive militaristic posture, this sense that certain races were more advanced than others, and that superior races had the right to assert their dominance and to guide other races, all of this, as I said earlier, thrilled and terrified other Americans. If it wasn't the same thing as European imperialism, it was, at the least, a soft version of imperialism, tempered, even if slightly, by American notions of republicanism. But to these critics, who are often called anti-imperialists, this soft version of imperialism spelled the end of the American experiment, because it meant that America might cease being what it had been, and was becoming more like a European empire, a country willing to dominate other nations and races for its own benefit, and without regard to the rights of other peoples. These anti-imperialists had a word for men like Roosevelt, and that word was jingo. Consulting the handy Webster's dictionary, we find that the definition of jingo is, quote, extreme chauvinism or nationalism, marked especially by a belligerent foreign policy. Now, Roosevelt had known Senator Henry Cabot Lodge since 1884. Both men saw eye to eye on building a strong national defense. But more than that, they both dreamed of their country taking its place among the world powers. Lodge believed that by getting Roosevelt in the new McKinley administration, that both men could direct the United States toward that end. By 1897, Lodge succeeded in getting his friend appointed to high office. From then on, the Roosevelt-Lodge partnership would help change the face of American diplomacy. All they needed was an opportunity to exercise their growing nation's strength. Now, it wasn't altogether clear what the new president, William McKinley's foreign policy views were. He was an avowed protectionist and pro-business, but that didn't say much about his views on empire. Nevertheless, on March 4, 1897, William McKinley took the oath of office as the 25th President of the United States. In his inaugural address, McKinley spoke words that sounded more like Grover Cleveland than Theodore Roosevelt. Quote, "It has been the policy of the United States since the founding of the government to cultivate relations of peace and amity with all nations of the world, and this accords with my own conception of our duty now. We have cherished the policy of non-interference with affairs of foreign governments, wisely inaugurated by Washington, keeping ourselves free from entanglement, either as allies or foes, content to leave undisturbed with them the settlement of their own domestic concerns. We want no wars of conquest. We must avoid the temptation of territorial aggression. War should never be entered upon until every single agency of peace has failed. Peace is preferable to war in almost every contingency." Around this time, McKinley was also said to have remarked, quote, "There will be no jingo nonsense under my administration." And he described annexation as, quote, "a criminal aggression." For those who worried that McKinley's views on economic expansion would be a form of soft imperialism, he responded that, quote, "Human rights and constitutional privileges must not be forgotten in the race for wealth and commercial supremacy." If McKinley's words reassured the hopes of anti-imperialists, those hopes would soon be dashed. America found itself tempted again by the forbidden fruit. As I said earlier, the United States, under President Grover Cleveland, rejected annexing the new Republic of Hawaii. But many in the United States still had their eye on the sugar-rich islands. An event would soon happen that provided another opportunity for annexation. In Hawaii, Japanese immigration had increased dramatically over the past few decades. In 1883, there were 116 Japanese on the islands. By 1897, there were 26,000. They were allowed in to provide cheap labor for the sugar industry. At some point, the government of Hawaii began to worry about whether Japan was trying to gain influence on the islands. And I think this is where it's important to remember the context here. Since 1868, Japan was rapidly industrializing and making its presence felt. And in 1894-95, the Japanese annihilated China in a war. To give you an idea of how complete that annihilation was, the Chinese outnumbered the Japanese 2-1, but suffered 7 times more casualties. With that, Japan had basically acquired the Korean peninsula and began building an empire. So if America was the rising star in the West, Japan was the rising star in the East. This was the Japan that many in the West, including in Hawaii, began to worry about. They worried that it would disrupt the balance of power in Asia. So in early 1897, Hawaii began to restrict Japanese immigration. And remember, this is the Hawaii governed by those friendly to the United States and who overthrew the existing kingdom there back in 1893. Well, the Japanese didn't take too lightly to these restrictions, so they sent a cruiser to the islands to make a statement. Japan's show of force was enough to worry many Americans about the security of the Hawaiian Islands, given their importance in the sugar trade and as a gateway to trade with the Far East. In June 1897, President McKinley took the original treaty of annexation that Cleveland had disposed of, and he submitted it to Congress. McKinley was convinced that Hawaii was key to American security, especially for the West Coast. McKinley is quoted saying, "We need Hawaii just as much and a good deal more than we did California. It is manifest destiny." He then sent multiple vessels to the islands to counter the Japanese presence there. In the event that Japan used force, he instructed a U.S. naval commander to land on the islands and announce that they had protectorate status soon to be annexed to the United States. If the new president was, as his critics charged, an empty vessel for business interest, he was at the least the decisive one and didn't shrink from a confrontation with Japan. But annexation was still controversial, and opposition was coming from other quarters. Some Americans were not thrilled with the idea of annexing a nation primarily of non-whites. And the beet sugar industry was not thrilled with the idea of competing with Hawaiian sugarcane. So the treaty stalled, for now. And McKinley's attention was soon directed elsewhere, to a part of the world closer to home. It was there that America would experience its greatest temptation to become an imperialist power. If America's day in the sun was just beginning in 1897, Spain's was ending. Spain was one of the first European countries to colonize the New World, and was at one point the leading power. It had owned, at certain times, massive chunks of both North and South America. In our 9th episode, we discussed the Louisiana Purchase, and how the entire Louisiana and Florida territories were owned by Spain. But by 1897, that was all history. Since the mid-1800s, Spain was struggling to hold on to Puerto Rico and Cuba in the Western Hemisphere, and Philippines, Guam, and a handful of other islands in the Pacific. Things were getting ugly in Cuba. Part of it was Madrid's own fault. The Spanish Parliament was led by reactionaries who opposed liberal reforms in the colonies. They imposed tax increases on Cuban planters and businesses, which mainly benefited the colonial government, not the Cuban population, and they censored all political opposition. In addition, the Cuban people were becoming more anti-slavery and were angered when the Spanish government refused to enforce the ban on the slave trade. Spain's heavy-handed ways ultimately provoked Cuba to fight wars of independence. The first two wars, one in 1868 and another in 1879, were unsuccessful. The Cubans were able to get slavery fully abolished in 1886, but Spain refused to budge, and the Cuban desire for independence continued to grow. America had its eye on Cuba for a while. It was becoming more economically invested in Cuba. By the late 1870s, Americans were buying up to 83% of Cuba's total exports. Americans were moving to Cuba and owned plantations and companies on the island, while Cuban expats were living in the United States. In fact, in 1881, the United States Secretary of State wrote, quote, "If ever ceasing to be Spanish, Cuba must necessarily become American and not fall under any European domination." But most Cubans weren't happy with the idea of replacing rule by the Spanish with rule by the Americans. This, along with Spain's intransigence, convinced Cubans to fight for independence from Spain before America could annex it. So on February 24, 1895, Cubans began uprisings all throughout the island. In response, Spain, led by Prime Minister Antonio Cánovas del Castillo, sent about 200,000 men to suppress the revolution. They sent a man that has become known to history as the Butcher. He was General Valeriano Weyler. General Weyler had helped suppress the previous uprisings, including the one that started in Cuba in 1868, and he was made governor of Cuba in January 1896. General Weyler implemented a brutal program called reconcentration. Basically, this meant forcibly removing the rural civilian population into an early version of concentration camps. As a result of Weyler's reconcentration policies, about 200,000 to 400,000 Cuban civilians died from starvation and disease in the camps. Meanwhile, Americans reacted to these events with mixed feelings. There were those who favored intervening into Cuba to free it from Spain, some for humanitarian reasons, some for the desire to expand America, some because they wanted the United States to control Cuban markets, and some because the Spanish presence in Cuba threatened the United States and its Monroe Doctrine. Many pro-imperialists were heavily in favor for not only intervening, but also annexing Cuba. And as we learned in our Louisiana Purchase episode, Americans don't like having any colonial powers nearby. And there were also those against annexation, and one of those was then American President Grover Cleveland. He wanted to find a way to settle the issue. At one point, President Cleveland proposed to the Spanish that the United States could broker some sort of deal between Spain and Cuba. Spain got a lot of criticism for its brutal policies in Cuba and delayed in responding to America's settlement offer. President Cleveland began to signal that America's patience could not last forever, and they would not tolerate the situation in Cuba indefinitely, especially if it meant 200,000 Spanish troops 90 miles off our coast. In his last State of the Union address in 1896, Cleveland said, quote, "It cannot be reasonably assumed that the hitherto expectant attitude of the United States will be indefinitely maintained. While we are anxious to accord all due respect to the sovereignty of Spain, we cannot view the pending conflict without considering that by the course of events we may be drawn into such an unusual and unprecedented condition as will fix a limit to our patient waiting for Spain to end the contest, either alone, in her own way, or with our friendly cooperation. The United States is not a nation to which peace is a necessity. The Cuba issue was the most pressing President McKinley faced as he entered office. The first thing he did was a reasonable one. He wanted to get more information. He wanted to separate fact from fiction and find out whether atrocities were really being committed in Cuba. So he sent an old friend, William Calhoun, who was a noted corporate lawyer and former member of the Illinois legislature, to investigate and report on the situation in Cuba. On June 22, 1897, Calhoun reported to McKinley that things were as bad as the rumors were saying. According to Calhoun, Spain's tactics left Cuba, quote, wrapped in the stillness of death and the silence of desolation. But instead of rushing headlong into intervention, President McKinley opposed annexing Cuba because he believed, quote, the U.S. would not know what to do with the island. He began calling for Spain to moderate its campaign in Cuba and introduce reforms that the Cubans wanted. He called on the Spanish specifically to end reconcentration and provide Cuba with autonomy. Spain had the chance to defuse the situation. They could have listened to McKinley. They could have chosen the path to reform and reconciliation. But it didn't. Instead, Madrid refused to consider McKinley's suggestions and claimed the full right to suppress the Cuban rebellion. And in a rebuke to the United States, Spanish officials stated that, in their eyes, the Union's suppression of the Confederacy in the American Civil War was no different than what Weyler was doing in Cuba. McKinley continued to call for reconciliation and for a fair, equitable solution. He urged Spain to grant Cuba autonomy, but did not call for outright independence. He appointed Stuart Woodford, a former member of Congress, as minister to Spain and instructed him to encourage Spain to end the rebellion quickly. Whether that was through autonomy or other means, he didn't want the conflict to continue so close to American shores, especially with American business interests at stake. On August 8, 1897, an anarchist assassinated Spain's repressive Prime Minister Canovas. By October, a new government was in place led by the more liberal Praxedis Mateo Sagasta. To many, including President McKinley, this represented a glimmer of hope. He hoped that the new Sagasta government would be more amenable to giving Cuba autonomy and making peace with the island. This hope appeared to be vindicated when, on November 25, 1897, Sagasta recalled General Weyler, ended his reconcentration policy, and released a plan to give Cuba increased autonomy. President McKinley was cautiously optimistic, but continued to keep up the pressure on the Spanish government. In his State of the Union speech on December 6th, McKinley said, quote, the near future will demonstrate whether the indispensable condition of a righteous peace is likely to be attained. If not, the exigency of further and other action by the United States will remain to be taken. And McKinley also beefed up America's naval presence in the Caribbean, sending the North Atlantic Naval Squadron near Key West. One of those ships was the Uss Maine, which also had contingency plans to go to Cuba in the event of an incident. More on that later. In the midst of all of this, a series of incidents would occur that put Spain and America on the path to war. The first involved a country that seemed to have little to do with any of this, Germany. As I said earlier, America was rising in the West and Japan was rising in the East. But in Europe, Germany had recently been consolidated into one nation. This was in the 1870s, and it was making its presence known. It had incredible industrial capacity and had just joined the scramble for colonial possessions. On November 14, 1897, the Germans took by force Kaichou Bay and forced the Chinese government to lease it to them for 99 years. To many observers, this signaled Germany's arrival as an imperial power. Then, closer to home, for the Americans, Germany took advantage of a domestic incident in Haiti. It landed 2 German warships on the Caribbean island. Apparently, a half-German man had been tried for committing a crime in Haiti, and the Germans demanded that Haiti compensate Germany for his treatment, the treatment he endured. Haiti had no choice but to comply, but it felt humiliated. In America, the incident rekindled fears that European colonialism was returning to the Western Hemisphere, at a time when Spain had hundreds of thousands of troops in Cuba. For many Americans, it reinforced the need to keep Europe out of the Western Hemisphere. Spain's new plan to give Cuba greater autonomy began in January 1898. But any hope that it would work was crushed when, that same month, a riot broke out in Havana, between the new Cuban government and some of the island's Spanish loyalists. These loyalists attacked 4 local newspapers that were critical of the Spanish government. Americans, including President McKinley, were losing any hope that peace could be maintained at all on Cuba, even with a weak Spanish rule. The U.S. Consulate General in Havana messaged Washington expressing fear for the safety of Americans living on the island. As a result, the USS Maine was sent to Havana. War drums were heard throughout the United States. Many imperialists saw Cuba as an opportunity to invade and expand America's overall territory. It was a chance for America to start an empire and join the class of great nations. And few in America were as thrilled at this prospect as Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt. Of the entire situation, Lodge, with eagerness, said, quote, "There may be an explosion any day in Cuba which would settle a great many things." The relationship between America and Spain deteriorated. Spain made an attempt to boost its navy by obtaining ships from Great Britain and from countries in Latin America. And on February 1st, 1898, Spain warned the United States that any interference, quote, would lead to an intervention which any nation possessing any self-respect would have to repel by force. Things worsened on February 9th. That day, the New York Journal, owned by newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst, published a letter that Spain's ambassador to the United States, Enrique Dupuy de Lome, wrote to a friend in Cuba. In the letter, de Lome wrote, quote, "McKinley is weak and catering to the rabble, and besides, a low politician who deserves to leave a door open to himself and to stand well with the jingoes of his party." Cuban revolutionaries had intercepted the letter and sent it to Hearst. It appeared in Hearst's paper under the headline, "Worst insult to the United States in its history." So a couple observations here about the de Lome letter. First, it shows that at least some Cuban revolutionaries were hoping to get America involved in the war against Spain. And second, we see a willingness of the American press to involve itself in the march to war. This was the era of what has been called yellow journalism, and the editor of the New York Journal, William Randolph Hearst, was the central figure. Encyclopedia Britannica defines yellow journalism as, quote, "the use of lurid features and sensationalized news in newspapers, publishing to attract readers and increase circulation." To use modern terms, it was basically the late 19th and early 20th centuries version of fake news and clickbait, the de Lome headline being case in point. Now, Hearst was a flamboyant figure who made a fortune off of yellow journalism. His papers featured massive headlines and lurid tales of corruption, sex, and murder. And he was a rabidly partisan Democrat. He was a millionaire who styled himself as a populist crusader, exposing the crimes of the elite and fighting on behalf of the downtrodden. During the 1896 election, he supported William Jennings Bryan against McKinley. As the crisis in Cuba escalated, Hearst saw an opportunity to sell papers. And what would sell more papers than a war? So Hearst took up the cause of the Cuban rebels. During that time, Hearst's New York Journal published articles full of false information about Spanish atrocities in Cuba. Now, as we said earlier, there were lots of atrocities going on in Cuba, but Hearst's papers were shamelessly exaggerating these reports. There's a famous story that, for many, describes what Hearst was like. It's not even clear that the story actually happened, but it's too famous to not mention here. It involves a man named Frederick Remington, an illustrator sent by Hearst to Cuba to cover its revolution against Spain. When Remington telegrammed Hearst that things were calm on the island, Hearst supposedly responded, quote, "Please remain. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." Regardless of how true this story is, this was characteristic of Hearst, a man who valued self-promotion over truth. In true sensationalist fashion, Hearst actually decided to sail to Cuba personally to cover the war. For many Americans, especially the anti-imperialists, Hearst was a dangerous demagogue, a man willing to cite international conflict for the sake of attention and selling newspapers. But not everyone agreed with him, not yet. An incident would happen that would do more to push the country into war than anything Hearst could have done. The USS Maine had been in Havana since January 25, 1898. At 9:40 p.m. on February 15th, a catastrophic explosion occurred on board the ship. The vast majority of the crew had been sleeping or resting when the explosion occurred. The front third of the ship was totally destroyed. Most of the rest of the ship sank to the bottom of the harbor. Although 89 men survived, 260 died, either immediately or soon after. 6 more died later from their injuries. The nation was shocked by the incident. Almost no one is alive who lived through that incident, but you have to imagine it was kind of like a late 19th century equivalent to the bombing of Pearl Harbor or 9/11. Not as many people were killed, but it was still significant, and it was happening in a time of great international tension. An aide recorded President McKinley's reaction when he heard about the explosion. Quote, "I handed him the dispatch, which he read with great gravity. He seemed to be very deeply impressed with the news, expressing great regret that the event had happened, particularly at that time." Unlike Pearl Harbor, it wasn't immediately clear who was responsible. Of course, the imperialists saw it as an opportunity. The day after, Roosevelt wrote to Secretary Long, quote, "It may be impossible to ever settle definitively whether or not the Maine was destroyed through some treachery upon the part of the Spaniards. Of course, I cannot pass any judgment in the matter until we hear from the court. The opinion of the other officers at Havana is nearly unanimous to the effect that there was no accident, but that the ship was destroyed by a floating mine from without. Our yellow newspapers have been shrieking forth the same view, but in their case wholly without any facts to back it." The same day, however, Roosevelt wrote to a friend, perhaps with a more honest expression of his views, quote, "Being a jingo, I would give anything if President McKinley would order the fleet to Havana tomorrow. This Cuban business has to stop. The Maine was sunk by an act of dirty treachery on the part of the Spaniards, I believe, though we shall never find out definitely, and officially it will go down as an accident." Hearst was close to getting his war. He wired a correspondent, quote, "Maine is a great thing. I'll rouse everyone." The nation was in shock, and then came the rage. Many agreed with Roosevelt that Spain was behind it all. The French ambassador to the United States wrote, quote, "A sort of bellicose fury has seized the American nation." Members of Congress felt pressure from their constituents to declare war against Spain, but President McKinley remained calm. As I mentioned earlier, he had served in the bloody Battle of Antietam in the Civil War. Thinking back to that time, he said, quote, "I have been through one war. I have seen the dead piled, and I do not want to see another." McKinley insisted that a decision be made only after an investigation on the source of the explosion was completed. Secretary of the Navy Long said, quote, "Judgment should be suspended until a full investigation is made." At the same time, McKinley continued to encourage Spain to settle the issue with Cuba. He offered to buy Cuba from Spain. The Queen of Spain actually considered it. Many in Spain believed that fighting the United States, the rising power of the West, would be suicide. But the Spanish military and much of the population were fervently against surrendering Cuba and giving it to the Americans. It reminds me a lot of the Mexican government in our previous episodes on Polk. Mexico refused key diplomatic overtures from the United States, and it ended in catastrophe for them. Spain apparently hadn't learned the lesson. While President McKinley dangled the carrot, he also held out the stick. He got Congress to pass a $50 million defense appropriation. But for those who wanted war, this wasn't enough. On February 25, 1898, Theodore Roosevelt, serving as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, seized on an opportunity. His boss, Secretary Long, took the day off. He had been under intense pressure and was suffering from muscle spasms. That day, Roosevelt took the helm of the United States Navy and fired off several orders. One of them was to Commodore George Dewey, commander of the Asiatic Fleet, instructing him to Hong Kong and then to the Philippines for, quote, offensive operations. Roosevelt was positioning America to attack the Philippines, which was then a Spanish colony. It would be an assault on Spain's empire, not just to liberate Cuba, but also the Filipinos. Historians have debated just what Roosevelt's orders meant for how history played out. Was he part of some rogue jingo cabal that wanted to expand American empire? Or was he acting consistent with the administration's wishes? After all, the military had been studying for a possible war with Spain for years and had prepared several plans of attack. At any rate, the next day, Secretary Long came back to work and discovered what Roosevelt had done. He remarked, quote, "During my short absence, I find that Roosevelt, in his precipitate way, has come very near to causing more of an explosion than happened to the Maine. The very devil seemed to possess him yesterday afternoon." To some, this is proof that Long, under McKinley's guidance, would have never made the order. But it is also true that neither McKinley nor Long revoked it. Around this time, Republican Senator Redfield Proctor visited Cuba to investigate what was going on. When he returned, he gave a speech on the Senate floor on March 17, 1898, quote, "I went to Cuba with a strong conviction that the picture had been overdrawn. What I saw I cannot tell so that others can see it. It must be seen with one's own eyes to be realized. To me, the strongest appeal is not the barbarity practiced by Whaler, nor the loss of the Maine, but the spectacle of 1.5 million people, the entire native population, struggling for freedom and deliverance from the worst misgovernment of which I ever had knowledge." While many doubted the accounts in Hearst newspapers, Senator Proctor's words gave weight to those who supported intervention. For more than a few American citizens, getting into a war in Cuba was a humanitarian intervention. This was something we hadn't really considered in American history before. Washington's policy of non-interventionism didn't seem to make an exception for humanitarian cases. Senator Francis Warren expressed these sentiments when he spoke of, quote, "the shame that we, a civilized people, an enlightened nation, a great republic, born in a revolt against tyranny, should permit such a state of things within less than 100 miles of our shore as that which exists in Cuba." Now, there are some who have argued that business interests were manipulating McKinley into war. It was kind of like the equivalent of those who opposed the war in Iraq in 2003 because they believed the Bush administration was just looking for oil. When you look at it, this argument appears to be a bit simplistic. While there were certainly many who had business interests in Cuba, there were also businessmen who opposed getting involved because they feared the uncertainty that war would bring for the stock market. It wasn't totally clear that war was in the best interest of business. And it wasn't clear that pro-imperialists and business elites were on the same side. As I said earlier, some of the captains of industry weren't thrilled about competing with foreign markets. By late March, McKinley was under immense stress. He was in a situation no president had been in since James K. Polk over 50 years earlier, potentially engaging in a major war with a foreign country. Around this time, the president's aide, George Cortelyou, said, quote, "For the past 2 or 3 days, he has looked haggard at times." McKinley around this time supposedly said, quote, "I pray that we may be able to keep peace." To Leonard Wood, McKinley said, quote, "I shall never get into a war until I am sure that God and man approve. I have been through one war. I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another." Then came a bombshell. On March 20th, the board investigating the Maine explosion released its report. It stated that the bottom plates of the Maine appeared to have been driven up, indicating an external explosion. To many Americans, that was enough. It had been an attack. And in their eyes, Spain was the only culprit. McKinley sent the report to Congress, but he still hoped for peace. In a last-ditch effort, McKinley reached out to the Pope, Leo XIII, to use his influence on Spain to come to an agreement, short of war. After all, Spain was Catholic, and the Pope had a great deal of influence there. But none of this worked. Spain refused to consider an armistice and any guarantee of Cuban independence. Historian Louis Gould speculates that Spain, at this point, was trying to buy for time and build support among other European countries to stop the United States. But it was a foolish move. President McKinley felt that his options were exhausted. The United States had given Spain ample time to resolve the situation. The time to act, in his eyes, was now. McKinley sent a message to Congress on April 11, 1898. In the message, the president spoke of, quote, "the intimate connection of the Cuban question with the state of our own union, and how the conflict between Spain and Cuba, quote, has subjected the United States to great effort and expense in enforcing its neutrality laws, caused enormous losses to American trade and commerce, caused irritation, annoyance, and disturbance among our citizens, and by the exercise of cruel, barbarous, and uncivilized practices of warfare, shocked the sensibilities, and offended the humane sympathies of our people. He discussed Spain's reconcentration policy, describing, quote, the horrors of the strife of a new and inhuman phase unprecedented in the modern history of civilized Christian peoples. McKinley justified American intervention on several points. First, he cited humanitarian reasons, quote, in the cause of humanity, and to put an end to the barbarities, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries now existing there, in which the parties to the conflict are either unable or unwilling to stop or mitigate. It is no answer to say that this is all in another country, belonging to another nation, and is therefore none of our business. It is especially our duty, for it is right at our door. In doing so, McKinley became one of the earliest presidents to justify using force for what he said were altruistic reasons. Second, he talked about protecting American citizens in Cuba and protecting the commerce and property of the American people. He cited the Maine explosion, not pointing the finger at Spain, but still using it as an example of the damage the chaos of war in Cuba was doing to Americans, regardless of who was at fault. And McKinley did something few American presidents have ever done up to that point, especially when it came to confronting another world power. Quote, in view of these facts and of these considerations, I ask the Congress to authorize and empower the President to take measure to secure a full and final termination of hostilities between the government of Spain and the people of Cuba, and to secure in the island the establishment of a stable government, and to use the military and naval forces of the United States as may be necessary for those purposes. Essentially, McKinley was asking Congress to give him the power to make war without asking it to declare war. Since then, we've seen presidents do the same thing. Truman did it in Korea, Johnson did it in Vietnam, and both Bushes did it in Iraq. They asked for the power to make war without an actual declaration of war. For many, this was the legacy of the Cold War and the destructive power of nuclear weapons. For many other reasons, presidents have wanted to avoid the formal process of declaring war. Declaring war is costly. It binds the president in ways that they don't want to be bound. Well, here we find President McKinley doing the same thing far earlier than most people realize, than most historical cases we have, before the advent of nuclear weapons, of ballistic missiles, and of instantaneous communication. In doing so, McKinley was reshaping the president's war powers and setting the tone for 20th century presidents. While some hesitated at granting the president what they felt was a blank check, Congress complied. The House passed McKinley's request overwhelmingly, 311 votes to 6, while the Senate passed it by a mere 7 votes. On April 20th, McKinley signed the bill. But the bill he signed included an amendment from a Republican senator from Colorado, a man named Henry Teller. Like many Americans, he feared that America, once in Cuba, would be tempted by conquest. Teller is quoted saying, "The American flag is the best flag in the world for Americans. It is not the best flag for men who do not want it. It is not the best flag for Cuba. Cuba's flag, not representing 100th part of the power or glory of ours, is the flag for Cuba." Teller's amendment made it illegal for the United States to annex the island of Cuba. In doing so, he spoke for many anti-imperialists and those who supported the war primarily for humanitarian reasons. It obliged the United States, quote, to leave the government and control of the island to its people once the situation had been pacified. Teller's move would play a major role in shaping future events. But the larger issue was that America was about to venture into an undeclared foreign war. For Spain, this was justification enough. On April 24th, it declared war on the United States. The next day, America responded in kind with its own declaration of war. At last, the war was official. And now 2 nations would go to war, one a dying empire and the other a rising one. And for many Americans, this war was more than just about Cuba. It was a competition between the 2 great European civilizations with very different visions of society. In the words of Henry Cabot Lodge, quote, "In our veins runs the blood of Holland and the blood of England. If after all the centuries it comes to us, much as we pray to avert it, to meet Spain face to face in war, it is because we are there in obedience to a greater movement than any man can hope to control. We are there because we represented the spirit of liberty and the spirit of the new time. And Spain is over against us because she is medieval, cruel, dying." To many, this war was a continuation of the competition between the Spanish-speaking peoples and the English-speaking peoples. It was just another link in the chain that stretched back to the English defeat over the Spanish Armada in 1588, the competition for the colonies, and even the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. And there were many layers to it. It was the Catholics versus the Protestants, the monarchy versus republicanism, or tyranny versus freedom. And it was an opportunity for America to finally take its place under the sun. President McKinley seems to have done much in his power to avoid war, but the war came, and somehow through it all, despite his own reluctance, he exercised power in a way few prior presidents had ever done. He had sought to make war, in part, on humanitarian reasons. Those actions would echo throughout the 20th century, as future presidents would do the same. Few men were more excited for what was to come than McKinley's number 2 man in the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was planning to make the most of the war. History would soon record that the war McKinley tried to avoid, but ultimately embraced, would serve as something he had never intended, as a launching pad for the career of Teddy Roosevelt. The story of the Spanish-American War and Teddy Roosevelt's role in it will be the subject of the next episode of This American President. This American President is produced by myself, Richard Lim, and Michael Neal. Thanks to my dad, Bert Chu. The music in this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. We also want to thank our Patreon supporters. You too can support us by going to patreon.com/thisamericanpresident and giving any amount you choose per episode that we release. If you like what you've been hearing, you can also help us by sharing an episode on Twitter or Facebook. I'm Richard Lim. We're back next time with more This American President.